Brian, it seems to me that the melancholic drowns in memory. I'm wondering if you can say something about the place of memory in the Bath Fugues.
The Bath Fugues is really about flight, as the word fugue is, and it's about poetic flight as well as musical flight. So Bach, of course, wrote fugues. It's really flying away from memory. I think this was a book that I really wanted to avoid because I'd already done Shanghai Dancing, which is about my family and my childhood, etc., all mixed into fiction. And I didn't want to repeat myself again. So the Bath Fugues was about people who had these psychological fugues. And a lot of these people, I've been doing some research on this, in the 1890s had discovered the bicycle. And of course the bicycle allowed them to travel from village to village. And some of them had never seen the next village. So because of military conscription around about that time, late 19th century, they escaped into other places and they gave themselves false names and they started up new families completely unbeknown to their real families. So a lot of these people had actually entered into a kind of fugue. And I wanted to explore this a little bit further, where they were in flight from their identity and they had taken kind of an early interest in what we now call identity theft. So basically that's what I started off doing in the Bath Fugues. And there are three parts to the Bath Fugues, three novellas, if you like. In many ways they're connected. And you can read them in any way you want. And things develop and reveal themselves as you make the connection. So it's a readily kind of book. And I've never really wanted to hold the reader by the hand and lead the reader through all these clues. In fact, somebody said to me that my fiction is very demanding for the reader because the reader has to fill things in. I think that, in one sense, I always feel a bit of a fraud if I were too simple. I never want to talk down to my readers. I'm always talking up to them, in fact.
Brian, may I ask a trilogy of questions about teaching creative writing? Number one, isn't the term creative writing a tautology? Either it's writing, then it's creative, and when it's not creative, it's not writing.
Yes.
Second, teaching creativity, isn't this a contradiction in terms? And number three, would you ever dream of applying yourself as a writer what you teach in courses?
Well, that's a pretty heavy trio of questions. Okay, let me take the first one. It sounds like an oxymoron, creative writing, but that's a very Anglophone term. In other words, if you were in Europe, there would be no such thing as creative writing. Writing is writing. And that's why I also dislike the way that we make generic compartments for things called novel, poetry, essays, etc. And our bookshops are divided like that too. If you go to Paris, you won't see that. There's no such thing called fiction and non-fiction. There's literature, there's literary essays or whatever, and a lot of those are mixed. So a European thing, as I was saying about Sebald, he wrote in ways that you could never classify as a novel, a fiction, or a non-fiction or an essay. Okay, that's the first thing. The second question, teaching creative writing. Well, you cannot teach talent. Talent is there or it's not there. What one can do is draw it out. And I think that being a writer gives you first row seat to see where the talent is and to draw them out. And of course, there are some students who are massively talented and they don't know it. And they won't even try to finish their degree. And you kind of say, what a waste, but maybe that's fine by them. I think there's a certain kind of osmotic process in being where I am as a professor of writing. I can actually say to them, well, writing is not just sitting down and writing a book. It's actually reflecting on the process as well and meditating on the process, and that makes you a better writer. And I've always thought that this is my motto: a thinking writer is a better writer. And I'm glad that even though I never had the experience of it. I went to Sydney University in the 1960s, and I remember David Ireland, a very famous Australian writer, came in to talk to us. It wasn't a creative writing class, and he said, "What are you guys doing here? You should all be at home writing." What am I doing here? Nothing. I'm getting paid to tell you this. So in one sense, I think people are very lucky these days to have writers in their midst who they can work with personally up close and up front. And I think that even though it's an American concept, we don't have a great tradition of it in this country. And we must remember that the first creative writing class started in America in Iowa University in 1936, and the first creative writing student was someone called Robert Frost. So, they have that long tradition, which we don't have, and we think it's kind of new and snazzy. But in fact, I think it's a very good environment to be in, where you're no longer just debating dead authors, you're no longer just accepting what your lecturers tell you or critiquing the critics. You are actually involved in making the literature of this country, and I think that that's the very, very cutting-edge point where things are happening at the moment. It's rare that there's somebody out there in the wilderness in a garret or something writing great stuff. I think it's more common you find good writers coming through institutions like creative writing institutions. So Tim Winton, for instance, was one who came through the creative writing program in the University of Western Australia under Elizabeth Jolly. So all of these traditions help. I think the myth is that somehow, if they do PhD or whatever in creative writing, that I will give them the entree into publishing. I think that's a huge myth. And I mean, I'm the last person that one should come to with that kind of advice. I left all my major publishers, mainly because I felt that I was just kneecapped by ignorance. I'm sorry, but that's the way it was. And now I've gone to Giramondo with Ivor Indig, and I now have a very canny person who knows how to edit, who knows what I'm on about, who knows literature, and that's so important to be working with someone as a friend as well as an editor.
Oh, hi, Brian. Just to ask, on another panel you mentioned translation and the importance of bringing texts from other literature into Australia, translation-wise. What about your work? Has that been translated, or are you planning? Do you want to expand on that?
Yes, it's another one of those paradoxes that, I've never pushed myself in sales and things like that. I don't, I think it was Henry Handel Richardson who at one stage said, you can't sell books like soap, and I still believe that. But I have been translated, and I've been followed by European publishing firms. So I'm translated into German and French. My next novel is coming out in about a month in France, and in Chinese. So I have been translated widely, and in some places in Europe they know more about me than they do here. Yeah.
Can I ask you, on what you responded to about not holding the author's hand and letting them fill the gaps? Can you say something, Brian, if you're willing to, about the series of photographs through Shanghai Dancing? For those of you who don't know Shanghai Dancing, which is a book I love, and I've been teaching it for a number of years, it's a very genre-crossing novel that plays a lot with the form of the memoir and the family history, the autobiography, but is a novel. And so they're all scattered throughout all these photographs. And I know the point is not to ask whether they are authentically within your family collection, but I wondered whether you could say something about what purpose they had for you in terms of the way that they speak to the textual parts of the narrative, and what kind of resonance you wanted them to have.
Yes, they're a contradiction to the text, because a lot of these photos were obviously photos I bought in shops and Temple Street in Hong Kong, and second-hand photos and things. There were some family photos, obviously, that I used. But no, it wasn't about authenticity. It's actually asking the question about authenticity. In other words, people always believe photographs, and they won't believe texts. So I'm really putting the two together and saying, okay, you believe images or do you believe text? I'm not illustrating the text with these photos. I think the photos have a narrative of their own. They kind of tell stories of their own. And they don't necessarily rely on the text where they're placed. And I think that those photos are, in the Middle Ages, monks, when they copied the Bible or whatever, they made very nice illustrations down the side, great figures. But they weren't illustrating the text. They were just reminders of death or reminders of our mortality. And I think that photos, when you sprinkle them through the text, that doesn't necessarily refer to the text, tell you that these people are dead in the photo. There's a sense of death there, and there's a sense of a reminder, that those moments are only captured momentarily.
I'm interested to hear that your work's been translated into Chinese. I was wondering, you're this mixture, aren't you, of Chinese and many other sources, and now you live in Australia. How do Chinese respond to your writing about China?
Well, in a mixed fashion. My I think the second novel that was translated into Chinese was called After China, and the first chapter of that dealt with the Chinese philosopher Lao Tzu and about his sexual practices. Like, the old ancient Chinese believed that if you had sex with 100 women without reaching orgasm, you would live to 100. This is for men, of course. Now, when that book was translated, the first chapter was completely taken out without my permission. And it was just censorship, plain old censorship. So there are these political things that I have to deal with. China is now far more liberal, I must say, so that the next novel, there hasn't been any of this. But as someone who cannot actually read Chinese, my mother did, and she used to read it, and she used to say she was the arbiter of whether it was a good translation or not. Now she's dead. But I have to get people to read it, and I will then know whether the wordplay, for instance, can be translated across into Chinese. So, yeah, those are the problems. Whereas since I can read French and I can read a little bit of German, I find those translations really, really good ones, because there is just a sense of play in French particularly.
The question this lady asked Brian was, do you consider yourself a poet?
I have trouble. I go through all kinds of moments where I think I'm a fraud, and then another time I get inspiration and maybe I am a writer. But to call myself a poet it's a huge misnomer. When I first started writing, I did start writing poetry, and I went to a poetry class. And I was told, no, forget it. And I think I never got over that. So and you were kindly mentioning the garden book. I tried out some of my poems in that, but I put it in the voice of someone else, and I also made a big critique of it at the same time. I think one has to be very careful about calling oneself something, and I never called myself a writer. Maybe I was able to say, yes, I'm a writer when I'd published 4 or 5 books. Because it's such a big honour to be a writer in a sense. Someone says, oh, you're a writer, that's really important. Whereas everybody now calls themselves a writer, whether they've published anything or not. But I always felt that, you had to earn the appellation. Oh, thank you. I hope so. Yeah.
I think that any members of your audience who've themselves dabbled in writing a little would be interested to know what your perhaps writing technique is. Assume yesterday you wrote all day and you come back this morning to carry on. Do you go back and read what you wrote yesterday to get the feeling and the tone? And if you do you edit gently or seriously before you move on, or do you simply pick up your fingers and type straight ahead from where you were yesterday?
Yep. I'm a terrible critic of myself, and I think that sometimes I hate my writing to such an extent that I fall into a huge depression and I can't move on, I'm paralysed. I think that's important. It's a process. In the job I'm in at the moment, it's very, very difficult because you're right. You have to have continuity, and you have to do what Patrick White said. He said you have to worship at the altar every day, and he meant his desk. Whether you write a single word or not, you've got to sit there for 3 or 4 hours worshipping. And I think that when I was a full-time writer, certainly that's what's important. And who was it? Nicholas Shakespeare, who was here at the Adelaide Festival 10 so years ago, made a very important point. He said, basically, to write a novel, you need 1 year lingering and loitering. He called it loiterature. And he said, you really need to just digest and take in things and consider yourself, not capable of writing yet. And you build, and it's like a good wine starting to ferment and starting to mature. And then in the second year, if you've got the luck to have that continuity, you write, and your writing is coming. Saul Bellow said that's the moment when you're just running around with a bucket catching it, and it's quite close to the truth that towards the end of a book, it is starting to write itself. It's like a voice somewhere else starting to write the book. So those pleasures are great ones. I could never name another pleasure. Because it's achievement as well. So, you go away from your daily work and you might say, okay, I earned some money or whatever. But when you've written a good chapter, nothing beats that. Nothing can beat it. You'll lose it after about 2 days. You kind of go back and you say, oh, well, wasn't that good? So, yeah, it's a life up and down, up and down, up and down. And it's depressing, and, it kills off your partners, basically. Because you have to live in a room, and then when you get into your manic modes, you have to come out and play, because playing is also important. And you need to listen to music and go dancing and do this and that. And it just drives your partner nuts. So in the end, I guess, in my own personal life, it's taken its toll as well.
Could you talk some more around the relationship between melancholia and creativity?
Well, the two things are always linked, and I think that people give melancholy a bad name because they are pathologizing it into depression. I think it's an essential quality to have because the silence of your thinking, it always helps to be sad as well as humorous. And I think that the productive elements of melancholy comes when you are forced to the bottom of the ocean, as it were. You're forced to kick off the bottom. I've never written better than when I've had a rejection. So when a publisher said, oh, I don't think this is our kind of book, I feel terrible. But the next day, I'm writing better than ever. So in a sense, melancholy is the switch that flicks into that creative moment. And people should never feel paralysed by it, I think it's very wrong that even when people are being pathologised as depressed people, that it's somehow their fault. Well, it isn't. It's part of human nature to be sad. It's part of human nature to be happy. And I think that it is a condition which is a fallow field for ploughing, for sowing seeds. And that is absolutely necessary for writing. I'm absolutely convinced.
Can I ask you, Brian, if you could say a little bit more about what you referenced at the beginning of your talk about channeling real life into the work, and you described that as a form of sacrifice. Could you say a bit more about that, and whether you think that a form of self-elimination is in fact a precondition to productive writing?
Yes. I tell my students, of course, that it's not about them, and that writing is never about you, although some parts of your life and your experiences are in there. But you've got to live the life of somebody else, the narrator, the voice, whatever. And I think that sometimes I inhabit people. I read a lot of biographies of writers, for instance. I read letters of writers. I'm reading Virginia Woolf's diaries at the moment too. So I learn that voice, and that voice inhabits me after a while. So I may not be writing, the character Virginia Woolf or whoever, but I'm actually taking on a tone. I'm taking on a tone also of a period, and it's a literary tone. So in one sense, when I was writing Drift, my novel set in Tasmania, I was actually becoming that person. It gets a bit dangerous sometimes, because I did a trip to Hobart to look up the archives, and I was becoming this person, Johnson, and it's hard to let go because the novel sustains you and it becomes you, and then when you've finished it, you have to actually say goodbye. It's like postpartum depression or something, and you got to let it go into the public sphere, and it's not yours anymore. So that's another thing, that after writing that novel, the novel is not yours anymore. It's in the public domain. Other people now will interpret it, will use it, will employ it, and that's the sacrifice too. I think that it cannot be just yours.
Thank you very much for coming, and please thank Brian Castro.
Thank you. Thanks very much.